Armenia is a small country in the South Caucasus facing increasing challenges. More Armenians live outside its borders than within it, and members of the diaspora have been celebrated worldwide. It has powerful rivals in Azerbaijan and Turkey, while its supposed allies, Iran and in particular Russia, have proven to be unreliable. It's a truism to say that geography defines your destiny, but Armenia is certainly in a difficult neighborhood. On two sides, its borders with Azerbaijan and Turkey are closed. A thin sliver of mountainous terrain links it to Iran to the south, and, looking north, the route to Russia leads through Georgia, which could be switching from a pro-Western path to one more directed towards Russia. Could Armenia be moving in the other direction? Is its future in the European Union and NATO? We traveled to Armenia to find out. This is Mount Ararat, where the Bible claims Noah's Ark landed, and it's Armenia's national symbol. You find it everywhere in this country, on the state emblem, the currency, and on cognac and cigarettes. There's even a football club called FC Ararat Yerevan. There's one huge problem with this. Ararat, while visible from the capital Yerevan, is actually across a closed border and inside Turkey. In a clear, physical sense, Armenia is cut off from the history it is so proud of. But Armenia's history is also a tragic one. On the outskirts of Yerevan is the Genocide Memorial Complex. Turkey has apologized for the events of 1915-1917, but insists they do not constitute genocide. But, undoubtedly, it was the most devastating period of Armenia's history, with some estimates putting the number of deaths at over 1 million. Many would argue that its recent war with Azerbaijan has been little kinder to the country.
Armenia is currently experiencing a very difficult period of its history. In terms of Armenia's losses, this period can probably only be compared to what happened 100 years ago, the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire.
The borders between Armenia and Azerbaijan are complex, with smaller and larger exclaves remaining, and many compromises were made. Some lasted longer than others. For many decades, the two countries were together inside the Soviet Union. What were Russia's motivations when delimiting the borders between Azerbaijan and Armenia? And did Moscow leave its former colonies in a good situation?
Sowieci tak poprowadzili granicę, ponieważ tak się kalkulowało z powodu...
The Soviets set the border like that for economic reasons, but the most important reason was to apply the imperial principle of divide and conquer. At the end of the 80s, during Perestroika, the Armenians started demanding that Nagorno-Karabakh be joined to what was then still Soviet Armenia. The government in Moscow supported Azerbaijan, fearful that granting the Armenians' demands would lead to a domino effect, which would see other republics making more demands. When the USSR collapsed, war broke out, and those two now independent countries entered their period of independence in a state of war. They still don't have diplomatic relations, and the border between them is closed.
Zamknięta jest pomiędzy nimi granica.
Which newly independent country would come out on top? For many years, now with support from Moscow, it appeared it would be Armenia.
Konflikt pomiędzy Armenią a Azerbejdżanem.
The conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh started at the end of the 80s, but the roots of the conflict obviously go back further. Nagorno-Karabakh was an exclave on the territory of Soviet Azerbaijan, settled in the majority by Armenians. The war lasted 2 years, from 92 to 94, and ended in victory for Armenia. The Armenians took control of the whole of Nagorno-Karabakh, meaning the autonomous oblast and a strip of land around Karabakh, especially between Armenia and Karabakh and Iran and Karabakh. And it was precisely here that the unrecognized Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh emerged. Moscow now supported Armenia in the Karabakh War because Azerbaijan, with its oil and gas, had started making direct contact with the large global oil firms, and Moscow didn't want Caspian oil and Caspian gas to be exported without its oversight. For decades, this status quo held. The Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh was recognized by nobody, including Armenia. the whole world, and by default also Armenia, recognized Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan, and a peace process was underway, overseen by the OSCE's Minsk group.
So, what went wrong for Armenia?
Just like us in the 1990s, we won the war but lost the peace.
And during this peace, Armenia's grip on its gains was temporary. Why?
Because we de facto found ourselves at an empty well when Russia began its special military operation in Ukraine and stopped supplying arms to Armenia.
With Russia no longer either willing or able to support Armenia militarily, Azerbaijan's next aggressive move proved decisive.
Stan taki trwał do 2020 roku.
This status lasted until 2020. In the summer, there was a serious escalation of tensions over Karabakh along the Armenian-Azerbaijani border, and most likely it was instigated by Armenia. In September, the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War broke out, which lasted 44 days. It ended with the leaders of Russia, Armenia and Azerbaijan signing a declaration according to which Azerbaijan, as the dominant party to the war, received its military gains, meaning around two-thirds of the previous Nagorno-Karabakh Oblast, and also the so-called occupied lands, including land between Karabakh and Armenia. Then we had another two-year hiatus. In 2022, there was a very large escalation of tensions, which saw attacks on the Armenian side this time. And finally, in autumn 2023, Azerbaijan performed a very rapid operation, which saw it gain control of the rest of the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh and of the entirety of its internationally recognized territory. Now, in 2025, all talk of any Karabakh conflict is over.
The natural question here is whether Armenia can accept these losses. Along the roadside are constant reminders of what they've lost. Azerbaijani flags on the nearby hilltops, or this sign to Stepanakert, a town once home to 75,000 Armenians, which in 2023 was renamed Hankendi and became a ghost town across the closed border with Azerbaijan.
There is an opportunity, at least, to have stability and peace in the South Caucasus, because again, current Armenian government is ready to accept post-September 2023 status quo. And it's not the case that entire Armenian society is ready to accept this. But again, current government is telling, I am ready to forget about Nagorno-Karabakh, I am ready to close the chapter, I am ready to normalize relations with Azerbaijan and Turkey, and I am ready to have more or less stable and peaceful region.
With the government willing to make very difficult decisions, does this open the way for an opposition with a more populist agenda?
There is no serious opposition today. The parliamentary opposition has very low approval ratings, and it can't be a serious competitor for our government. Yes, the government itself doesn't have the highest approval ratings. Over 60% of the population don't trust any political party. So everyone's waiting for a third force to emerge. If any third political option appears, either a few groups or political columns which can present society with any kind of serious alternative to the parliamentary opposition and the current government, then they could be successful. But at present, I don't see anything like this.
Society, though, is convinced about what they see as the priority for the state.
Пункт первый – это обеспечение безопасности.
The first point is ensuring security on a higher level. Approximately over 40% of society thinks this is the most important issue. The second point is the economy, with around 14 to 15%. It's a big difference. It's security. I think the government has managed to do a few very important things in this area. Firstly, Armenia's military budget will be $1.7 billion. That's 4 times higher than under the previous administration. Their last year in power, it was $443 million.
Whether or not this increased spending on defense works out will depend partly on how Armenia is able to function with its enemies closer at hand, and with its traditional allies and its newer, further-flung allies. Looking at the map, if Armenia is to find a friend, it would seem the most natural place to look would be to its northern neighbor, Georgia.
Gruzja jest dla Armenii oknem na świat.
Georgia is Armenia's window to the world. Transit to Armenia goes through this country from the European countries through Turkey, through the Black Sea and Turkey itself, but also from the Russian Federation. The border with Georgia, as with the Iranian border, was always open. But Georgia is closer to the state capital and the industrial centers in the north of Armenia than Iran is. And the road's better because there's a very high pass on the way to Iran. Georgia and Armenia are two very old Christian countries on the edge of Europe, and very many things link them. And while relations are not currently extremely warm, they are very correct, and both countries understand that they are in some sense stuck with each other. They have to get on so that the transport routes stay open and in order to function in the region.
We need to remember that there are natural strains in the relationship. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Georgia embarked on a pro-Western path, while Armenia had a more pro-Russian stance. And this potential conflict of interests has been put to the test.
W 2008 roku, kiedy
In 2008, when the Russian-Georgian War happened, Armenia was then clearly orientated towards Russia, but turned down Russia's request to attack targets in Georgia from Armenian territory. The Georgians obviously appreciated this, and if we look at the schedule of political visits in Georgia and Armenia, we can see that politicians from the neighboring country make frequent visits, which is testament to the great intensity of contacts.
dużej intensywności kontaktów.
Ironically, as Armenia begins to make overtures to the West, Georgia could be drifting back towards Russia. And without Georgia, Armenia's move to the West looks doubtful.
Jako przykład można wymienić
We could take the example of the deliveries of French armoured carriers to Armenia. They were sent through the Black Sea and Georgian territory. Georgia hesitated for a long time before allowing the French shipment through. It did finally allow it, but if Russian influence increased there, then things like this could become difficult.
While Georgia would seem to be a natural ally, Iran is different. It was not colonized by Russia. It's not a Christian country, and it is certainly not a country moving closer to the West. So what does link the two countries? And where do the limits of their cooperation lie?
Za moimi plecami jest Iran. Pod tymi górami biegnie rzeka Araks, która była granicą.
Behind me is Iran. At the foot of those mountains is the river Aras, which was once the border between the Soviet Union and Iran. Now it's the border between Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Iran. Armenia has around a 40-kilometer access to Iran, and it's a gateway to the world for it. Armenia and Iran are linked by long-reaching historical ties. It's a few thousand years of shared history. Very often Armenia was ruled by Persian dynasties, which became Armenianized. Very often it was ruled directly by Iranians or by the local Khans subjugated to the Iranians. It could be said that there's a certain strategic way of looking at the situation in the region which is very similar for Armenia and Iran. They see their main rivals and even enemies in a similar way. One large barrier in developing Iranian-Armenian relations is the status of Iran, meaning its conflict with the United States and the West. Even though the Americans and Europeans completely understand the need for Armenia to cooperate with Iran, there is still a kind of taboo regarding possible military cooperation. So, at least officially, nothing like this is being done. There's no doubt that Iran is an important part of Armenia's security policy, though. For example, concerning access to the Indian market. Today, since the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, it's precisely India which has been the main military partner when it comes to arms supplies to Armenia. And it will be this way that the weapons are transported from India to Armenia.
While it's true that officially there is no military cooperation between Iran and Armenia, it cannot be ignored that their interests are aligned at their border. And there are rumors that this is on a very large scale.
There is a second factor which isn't spoken about. Only expert circles know about it. It involves Iran having 145,000 soldiers at the border with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Approximately a third of them are units of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and this group possesses a lot of artillery, attack drones, and even hypersonic chemical weapons. This is a very serious deterrent.
What shared interests could a Christian country have with the Islamic Republic of Iran? It concerns this 40-kilometer-long valley along their shared border. Look on both sides of it. The Nakhchivan exclave is separated from the rest of Azerbaijan. The war demanded far-reaching concessions from Armenia, but it didn't solve all of the problems between these two former Soviet republics. And the border is, in geological terms, the natural place for a corridor to unite the divided territory of Azerbaijan. But neither Armenia nor Iran are pleased with this idea.
Ormianie obawiają się, że to miałby być eksterytorialny korytarz.
The Armenians fear that it would be an extraterritorial corridor which would in fact cut them off from Iran. The Iranians fear the same thing. If a corridor linked Azerbaijan with Nakhchivan and Turkey, it would create something that for the Iranians would look like a pan-Turkish or pan-Turkic strip cutting Iran off to the rest of the world to the north. This is why Iran is consistently sending both political signals and also military murmurs, hints about its opposition to the construction of a corridor of this kind. It signals its support for Armenia and thus stresses its difficult relations with Azerbaijan and Turkey. If we put the political fears over security to one side for a moment around Armenia and its territorial integrity, then in fact this is a very natural area for a transit route. The Aras Valley can have roads. In Soviet times there was a railway here which went further on to Yerevan, because it's difficult to put a railway in the mountains of the current Republic of Armenia.
But the political concerns appear to be more important for Armenia.
And the Armenian government, again, it's very clear. We are ready to provide transit and to provide and to allow all countries who are interested to have any cargo transportation via Armenia to provide this fully in line with international regulations and international laws. What Azerbaijan is telling, they are saying, no guys, no international laws, no international regulations. We would like to use Armenian territory to connect to Nakhchivan and Turkey, but A, we don't want to see any Armenian passport control. B, we don't want to see any Armenian border troops. C, we don't want to see any Armenian custom officials. So de facto, Azerbaijan demands extraterritorial corridor to be connected with Nakhchivan and Turkey. And this is of course not acceptable for Armenian government.
And what about Armenia's other Turkic neighbor, Turkey? Despite their difficult shared history, there is hope that the countries could move closer.
Ormianie mają świadomość tego, że
Armenia is well aware that Turkey is a potentially very important partner, and regardless of the conflict with Azerbaijan, it has always tried to normalize its relations with Turkey, to open the border, to open diplomatic and political relations. They tried in 2009 and also in recent years. Armenia consistently maintains the wish to have these relations with Turkey. It's built road infrastructure to the border, and there have been a few meetings between the Prime Minister of Armenia and the President of Turkey. They provided aid after the earthquake in Turkey, but nonetheless, the border is still closed.
But unfortunately for Armenia, more recent history prevents closer ties with Turkey.
The Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict is strictly linked to Armenia's relations with Turkey. The borders closed there. Turkey closed its border with Armenia in solidarity with Azerbaijan at the start of the 90s, wanting to force Armenia to make concessions. And the Turkish side has said it's ready to come to terms with Armenia. But first Armenia needs to come to terms with Azerbaijan.
There are even those in Armenia who see this as a return to pan-Turkism, and that Russia is now the weak man of Europe, taking part in a project to cut off Armenia's access to the south.
The priority for Turkey's foreign policy are the Turkic states, and they don't try to hide this. The Organization of Turkic States, which you can see already practically publicly, Erdogan and Aliyev want to transform into a military political organization along the lines of a Turkic NATO. You know, I've always thought that the closer Turkey is to the West, the better it is for Armenia, the more predictable a country it is. But that's not this period. Turkey is obviously using Russia, totally, and Russia is totally under Turkey. And Russia plays the junior partner with all its allies, with North Korea, Iran, Turkey, all of them.
Whether it's due to the Russian army struggling in Ukraine and Syria, or because Russia needs good relations with Turkey, The perception in Armenia is that of Russia having broken its promises. When the clashes took place on de jure Azerbaijani territory, Russia could make excuses for its inaction. But when the war moved to Armenian territory, these excuses were no longer valid.
Sytuacja radykalnie zmieniła się jesienią 2000.
But the situation changed radically in the autumn of 2022 when, during an escalation in tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, targets were struck on the territory of Armenia itself. Armenia turned to the Collective Security Treaty Organization for help, but no help was forthcoming. Russia provided no assistance to Armenia, neither as a country nor as a member of the CSTO. So the Armenians understood that they can't count solely on Russia when it comes to their country's security.
Ultimately, Azerbaijan saw Russia's hesitation as a sign of weakness and was emboldened to the point where it attacked the Russian military itself. What was Russia's reaction to this insult from its former colony? Purely symbolic, and a rapprochement with Azerbaijan.
Znajdujemy się w miejscu upamiętnienia dwóch rosyjskich wojskowych.
We are at a memorial to two Russian soldiers who were shot down in a helicopter by Azerbaijani forces at the end of the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War on the 9th of November 2020. As you can see, the Russians have linked this to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Behind me is a symbol of that aggression, the letter Z. The Second Karabakh War totally overturned the existing order in the region. Since then, we can say there's been a reorientation of Armenia's foreign policy, but a new system has also been forged in the region. Azerbaijan was determined enough to change a system that had been unfavorable for it for many decades and went so far as to shoot down a Russian helicopter. After that, the positions of Azerbaijan and Moscow moved closer together.
Pozycje Azerbejdżanu i Moskwy zaczęły się zbliżać.
In fact, many Armenians now see Russia less as an ally and more as a security risk.
On the 29th of November 2023, a ceasefire was signed with Russian mediation. There were so-called Russian peacekeepers there. And after that, precisely with assistance from the Kremlin, already in 2023, a complete ethnic cleansing was carried out in Nagorno-Karabakh. The International Republican Institute conducted research in autumn 2023 which included the question, what country do respondents think is a threat to Armenia's security? It won't surprise anyone that in first place Armenians chose Azerbaijan. Also unsurprising was Turkey in second place. But in third place, they chose the Russian Federation.
But Armenia already has enemies in its neighborhood and cannot risk adding Russia to that list. What influence does Russia still have there?
Russia has a lot of ways of influencing the situation in Armenia. It still has a military base here. Border troops of the Russian Federation in the security service are stationed on Armenia's borders with Iran and Turkey. Recently, these units were removed from the border points in Yerevan's Zvartnots airport, but they're still stationed at the border. There are also Russia's assets in the economy, in energy, the railways. And finally, there's Russian soft power. For example, in the center of Yerevan, there's Russian Book House. This influence is nevertheless diminishing.
One obvious question arises here. Where can Armenia look for allies, if not to Russia? The last years have seen a cautious reorientation towards the West. In the case of the European Union, its presence in Armenia is exemplified by its mission, defined in January 2023. We traveled to its headquarters in Yekheknadzor to find out more about it.
Misja Unii Europejskiej w Armenii.
The European Union mission in Armenia was formed on a request we received from Armenia's foreign minister Ararat Mirzoyan. He asked the EU to send a mission to Armenia as its contribution in stabilizing the situation in the country and the region. The first decision was for 138 members of the mission. After a few months, due to the highly complex and difficult terrain to monitor, it turned out that the number would need to be increased, and in November 2023, the Council made the decision to increase the mission to 209 members. We're currently in the process of filling the final vacancies. At present, there are around 170 or so people, so we still need to fill 30 posts, and we hope to achieve this in the next few weeks. The mission is made up of the so-called international personnel, so citizens of the EU member states, and the local staff, meaning Armenian citizens. For a while we also had a Canadian colleague as part of the third country contributing state support.
Consensus was easy to find among the EU's member states. They felt that the EU should be doing something in this part of its neighborhood. But is the mission effective? And is it welcomed by the Armenian public?
Obywatele Armenii mogli zetknąć się.
It was the first time Armenian citizens could come into contact with the European Union. Our presence is tangible proof that the EU can be a factor bringing measurable stabilizing benefits, because we have this opportunity. Our colleagues monitoring the border every day, who go out to observe the borders, they meet the residents of the villages on the border every day, and they hear thanks for this presence, because the perception is truly, absolutely a positive one. The local population can clearly feel an improvement in their security. They feel safer and somehow protected. Because certainly the number of incidents has significantly decreased since the mission appeared in Armenia. This means that we have a positive reception from Armenia's society and its government.
Azerbaijan, though, is not as enthusiastic about the EU mission.
Jak się można domyślać, ten odbiór jest zupełnie inny w Azerbejdżanie.
As you can imagine, the reception is entirely different in Azerbaijan, which from the start has taken a negative stance on the presence of the mission in Armenia. At the very beginning of the negotiations on forming the mission, it seemed that the Azerbaijanis would have a little different stance, because they agreed to the presence of the first 2-month mission, which was a kind of introduction to forming our current mission. But after this 2-month period, Azerbaijan diametrically changed its stance and stated that the further presence of observers on Armenian territory is unacceptable for it.
And those so-called European peace observers, which are retired military and policemen, I'm sure they will run away if something serious happens.
They made this felt by leading an intensive disinformation campaign targeted against the mission, and occasionally against individual countries which are particularly involved in supporting Armenia, for example, France.
In order to respond to Azerbaijan's claims, the mission wanted to open a liaison office in Baku, but this offer was turned down. In spite of this, they continue to demonstrate their neutrality.
Further to the point, we send a weekly plan of our patrols to both the Armenian and Azerbaijani authorities. Both sides receive the same plan of patrols, so we can confirm that we are truly neutral here. We're a neutral observer, and we're trying to treat both sides the same. But so far we've had no reaction to this gesture from Azerbaijan, but we work on the assumption that this is the right road to take in order to build up this neutral character of the mission we so highly value.
The presence of EU patrols means that Armenia has peace missions from both the West and from Russia on its territory. What happens when their patrols meet?
We've met around the border with Iran, professional encounters. For many months this caused some difficulties in accessing part of Armenia's territory. There was the village of Nurkinhand in the southern Syunik province. Because of Russian soldiers stationed there, access to this area was off limits for us. It was only in August 2024 when a new agreement was signed between Moscow and Yerevan to withdraw some Russian troops from Armenia that this contingent around Nurkinhand left, and so we gained direct access to the area. So we had this kind of contact, or rather it was a lack of contact, because we knew Russian forces were present and wouldn't allow us to patrol the area, so we simply avoided going there. I emphasize that our mission only monitors the border with Azerbaijan. The Russians, on the basis of that old agreement, monitor the border with Iran and Turkey. The second kind of contact is with these Russian border troops on the border with Iran. We've had contact with these on numerous occasions. Our colleagues on patrol have encountered them. I'd say they were very professional in nature, with no signs of aggression. The Russian border troops simply pointed out that the agreement of 1992 grants them the competence to patrol this area and instructed our colleagues to leave the area. And that's how the contact ended. And at a certain point, being aware of their presence and attitude, we stopped sending our patrols there in order to avoid these encounters.
This stability allows Armenia to invest in the territory that remains after the war. The focus now is on the north-south route.
Jesteśmy na drodze M2, która...
We're on the M2 road, which is of strategic importance for Armenia as it's the route to Iran, which is one of the countries which Armenia has an open border with. It's an important road because it's a section of the north-south route linking the Persian Gulf, linking Iran with Russia and potentially with Europe. But it's precisely on the north-south axis. This road clearly shows how much has changed here over the last 4 years, because 4 years ago the main road ran in another area and cut across land which in administrative terms belonged to Azerbaijan, but which were controlled by Armenians. When Azerbaijan captured Karabakh, the Azerbaijanis cut off this road and travel became de facto impossible, and the Armenians were forced to build a new road in much less accessible places. And they managed this very quickly. Now this road is one of the best in Armenia in terms of the surface and its throughput. There is in fact a similar problem in northern Armenia, where the newly demarcated border in disputed areas meant Armenia lost sections of roads leading to Georgia, meaning they had to modernize and reroute those main transport routes too.
Just a few months ago, Armenia signed a new loan agreement with EBRD, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, like 250 million euros approximately, loan to modernize highways in Syunik. What is interestingly that, for example, in Syunik, when we speak about infrastructure, both Russia and European Union are giving loans to Armenia to modernize this infrastructure. I mentioned about EBRD loan, but also just in early December, Armenian parliament ratified an agreement with Eurasian Development Fund, which is a Eurasian Economic Union related fund, to receive $200 million of loan, again, to modernize highways in Syunik. So interestingly, both European Union and Russia, or Eurasian Economic Union, are providing money to Armenia to develop infrastructure in Syunik and in general to develop infrastructure in Armenia. So at least from this perspective, development of Armenia's infrastructure, we see that both Russia or Eurasian Economic Union and the European Union are on the same page.
So Armenia is moving forward in this time of peace. Long-term, two scenarios are visible: a normalization of relations with Azerbaijan and Turkey, or the return of war. Should Armenia fear this?
How big is the risk that Azerbaijan will launch another attack against Armenia? And I'm afraid that risk in 2025 will be higher than in 2024. Why? Because at least in 2024 there was one deterring factor, it was COP29. It was clear that Azerbaijan is not going to launch a war in South Caucasus, while it was preparing to have this biggest event in independent Azerbaijan history.
Если миссия Европейского Союза останется на наших границах,
If the EU mission stays at our borders, even if there's no peace deal, the situation will be peaceful. It will be stable.
будет спокойно, эта ситуация будет сохранена.